Murdorf and the Mortal Flaw, Book 1, Chapter 20, A Night in a Cave. It was nightfall when the riders reached a cave. Beams of light shone through the trees, dappling their faces as they gathered wood for a comforting fire. Inca did the honors of lighting the wood pile at the entrance of the cave. Hungry, the riders roasted a peasant they bagged along the way. "So, you lived in this cave?" Osby wanted to strike up a further conversation with Sagran. Yes, I did. This cave goes back real far." He shared some stories of his experiences from long ago and talked much about his late wife. It was obvious that he adored her. The riders became more acquainted with Sagran and Amace, soon embracing them as friends and fellow riders. By the time they had devoured their supper, they had also put aside their reservations about inviting them onto their team. Intuitive vibrations still stirred within Navi regarding Amace. Those eyes. There was something about them, something about him. He knew the two of them belonged with them. He just didn't know why. Not yet. After much talking and more eating, they all grew tired and slowly drifted off to sleep. Sagran stood outside, peering onto the obscurity of the woodland. The thick fog covering the ground made it difficult to see in the breaking dawn of the morning. Out of the midst, a sketchy form, an indescribable figure, appeared over the hills, riding swiftly towards him. A shiny steel sword above the rider's head came into view as he rapidly approached, galloping on a black horse, the cape of the dark rider grappling in the wind. Now he could see that it was a dark knight, a Quadarist bent on evil. Sagran drew his sword. Both of his hands gripped the hilt, with a mixture of confidence and fear. The heavy breathing of the rider of Quadar and the sound of his horse's hoofs were the only discernible noises. But only Sagran could hear was his own heart pounding. The warrior looked as though he were hell-bent on running him over. Suddenly, when he was nearly atop of him, he stopped, bringing his mount to a standstill directly in front of Sagran. Eye to eye, they stared each other down. Sagran repositioned his sweaty hands, anticipating his next move. Expecting a fight, as he studied this form of death, he noted the eyes. So familiar. At first sight, he looked like every other rider of Quadar. He was dark, decaying, and direful, capable of putting the fear of God in any soul. Sagran felt his blood run cold, but those eyes he had seen before. Then he knew. "Naka, is that you?" he asked, scrutinizing the dark figure. He lowered his sword. "It's me, Sagran, your brother. You can come back now. You don't have to stay on this side of Quadar. You can come home and get a fresh start." The dark warrior lowered his sword. They silently fixed their eyes upon each other. Recollection stirred up memories, brother to brother, times of youth, years of bonding. Just when Sagran thought his brother was coming back to him, the man raised his sword high above his head and nudged his horse into a full run. Before he knew what was happening, the rider's piercing blow penetrated his neck. His blood spilled onto the ground. Sagran gasped to breathe as he sat up. He clutched his hands around his neck, expecting to feel blood, surprised that his head was still attached. He realized it was only a dream, a nightmare that haunted him from time to time. He wiped away the sweat that had formed on his forehead, pondering the dream. He wondered if his brother was capable of killing him. Next, he wondered if his brother was capable of leaving the evil. Would he know me if he saw me? Perhaps, Sagran thought. The riders awoke early before dawn and mounted their beast. Their only light source was Navi's oar. They rode without opposition, reaching the forest of memory in the mid-afternoon. Northern winds brought in a chill, but their jackets sufficed to break the wind. It was as they broke through the midway point of the second mountain that they ran into trouble. Just up ahead, the shadowy figures of a band of riders of Quadar crested the hill. It was a small group, but opposition was imminent. The Quadarists heeled their horses and sprang into action, eager to shed blood. With their swords drawn, the circle of riders dug their heels into their mounts, not slowing down to reconsider or count the consequences, even though They were outnumbered 5-1. They converged to fight. With pugnacity, the circle of riders crossed blades with the riders of Quadar, the sound of combat testifying to the harsh realities of the markings of further conflict. The sharp sword swung close to Mongard, but with expertise he sprang off the side of the tree and onto a horse of a dark rider, plunging his dagger through the dark rider's tender skin. Once Mongard's feet hit the ground, he leapt like a lion onto another Quadaris, ducking first to miss the edge of the dark warrior's blade. Mongard rammed his dagger into his abdomen. A mace and Sagran proved to be assets demonstrating proficiency of their blades. They proved to have a keen eye as well as a swift hand, able to assess the battlefield of both their allies and enemies, and fight at the same time. They were naturals. Cosby and the Quadaris ran side by side through the forest, their blades swinging as they rode through the pathless terrain, both dodging the trees while fighting. As Cosby moved in for the kill, his horse tripped over an upturned root, and he toppled over the head of his horse. When he hit the ground, his sword fell from his hand and tumbled down an embankment far out of reach. His weapon was lost, and he lay vulnerable. Stunned by the fall, he sat up scanning the area for his sword. He spotted it far out of reach down between the rocks. Then he saw out of the corner of his eye the blurry outline of the gruesome rider. His horse pranced directly in front of Cosby, coming into full view, the dark warrior's ego spilling over. Cosby looked at the sword that lay out of reach and back at the rider. He braced himself, knowing full well this was it. He was about to die. He feared death. Deep, black, unfeeling eyes stared into his fearful eyes, reading him as though they were staring into his soul. Death, this is it. Let it be quick, he hoped. Cosby felt his heart pound in his chest. He covered his head and sank meekly to the ground, anticipating the biting chill of death. After an eternal moment, he raised his head and gazed into the shocking eyes of the monstrous warrior once again, only closer, the darkness spilling over into Cosby's heart. His black face hung with pierces of rotting flesh, and the hollow of his eye sockets were deep with darkness. Black, decaying hands gripped his sword with confidence. The rider's stare communicated only clearly as words. Their eyes remained locked, and they seemed to understand one another without a single word being spoken. Then, nodding his head, the rider paused. Cosby nodded his own head, agreeing to the terms. The rider turned and galloped away. Cosby's life was spared. His life had flashed before him, but now he had it back. Frozen in fear, Cosby remained motionless. It felt as though everything had come to a standstill except for his racing heart. The silence was only broken by the sound of Gamonza calling out his name. Cosby, Cosby. The sound of his name brought him back to reality, back into the land of the living. He quickly slid down the embankment, got his sword, climbed back up, and boarded his horse that had faithfully strolled over to him, and Cosby rode out to meet him. He remained mum about what had transpired in the forest, yet his pale face and peculiar mannerism told on him. "You okay?" Nobby asked. "Yeah, fine." "Are you sure?" Ozzy now prodded him. He could read the fear in his eyes and the chill in his voice. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," said Cosby, his tone less than convincing. Riding out, they now met the others, who also sensed something was wrong with their comrade. "What's wrong?" Bolgar inquired. "Nothing's wrong," snapped Cosby, edgy and irritable. Shaken by the encounter, Cosby rode silently, meditating on what had happened and glad to still have his head.